Hi, welcome back. Another security stories for you. I know these are popular, so I've been scouring my mind as to what I can tell you about the stuff I did. And there were a few things I kind of didn't mention before because I thought they might be not appropriate subjects or whatever, but I think we can probably deal with those as long as we keep the comments mature. So this one is actually about sex workers, and it might surprise you to know there's often an intrinsic link between those two for various different reasons. But my first ever experience with sex workers was actually reasonably funny, I guess. I was about 19 and I'd been asked to accompany a couple of, let's call them businessmen. They were kind of wide boys. They were buyers and sellers of things. They weren't, serious gangsters, but they were kind of like traders. And at the time, Viagra was a huge thing, and they were looking to do some kind of deal over in Europe to buy some kind of large volume of Viagra and start trading in these things over in the UK. I didn't really know much about that. I didn't frankly care about it, but I was offered, I kind of knew them through a friend, and they were looking for someone to accompany them because they weren't particularly tough guys. And they were very worried that they were going to get attacked or, turned over or something when we got to this other end, which happened to be in Amsterdam, of all places. So I was very, very careful about what I was doing because I was well aware that you could get dragged into something there that would be pretty criminal and could get you in a lot of trouble. I'd been brought up in a place where there just didn't seem to be any sort of sex work or any of that going on. I had had a fairly quiet upbringing in terms of, sex and stuff. I'd had a pretty normalised teenage years of, copping off with girls, and then I think I lost my virginity when I was like 16, but nothing particularly unusual. So I had not had any massive exposure to that kind of thing. I got over there with these guys, and of course, if anyone's been to Amsterdam, that you will know you're not going to miss seeing sex workers there. They're literally everywhere in certain parts of Amsterdam in the red light district. And this was back in the days when the guys, were walking me around. They were kind of laughing because they had obviously been there several times before, and I was fairly naive to it. They were actually pretty pleased to have me with them because during our walk round we got constantly harassed by like quite aggressive guys that were clearly trying to sell Class A drugs. They wanted you to buy cocaine, they wanted you to go with them to some weird club or whatever, and a lot of it seemed like a scam. So if anything, I was earning my money just kind of keeping these guys clear of the two business guys I was with. And we were walking through, and I was actually surprised at how beautiful the girls were there. There were literally hundreds of girls, and they were broken up into like sections. You would have a section where there was like a bunch of Thai girls. There was a section where there were Thais that were maybe boys, maybe girls. That was kind of unsure. Guess it was like a Russian roulette there. And then there was a section with like lots of black African girls, quite big girls, some of them. There were sections where you had girls from, certain parts of Europe, and there were absolutely stunning girls there, like some of the most beautiful girls I've ever seen. And also some of the not so beautiful girls, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? So maybe they weren't beautiful to me, but I'm sure that other people had their own perceptions of what they were looking for. One of the big black African girls actually grabbed me by my hand as we were walking by and started pulling me in. And they've all got these, like, there's basically a window that they stand in, and then there's a very small room behind that. These rooms are literally leased out from the government. It's all legitimately run, and the small room has like a tiny little bed in it, some towels, a little sink, not much else. And normally there's like a curtain area at the back or whatever, and I could see a kind of guy lurking behind the curtain in the back, and then this girl trying to really desperately pull me into the room. She was basically shouting, "I'll do you for free, I'll do you for free." I was obviously pulling back the other way because she weighed about 35 stone, not in my sort of category of what I would be interested in, even if it was free. And at the time it was 50 guilders, right? If you wanted to spend 15-20 minutes with these girls, it was 50 guilders, which worked out about £16. I mean, this was before the euro, so that gives you some idea. That was surprising to me of how little money they were making, especially some of the girls that were absolutely stunning. I mean, they could have literally been models, some of them, and they're making £16 every 15-20 minutes. Anyway, the guys I was with actually got hold of my other hand, so now I'm like in the middle of a tug of war situation. And my biggest concern wasn't actually that this woman was going to do me, although I was concerned about that. My biggest concern was that there was a very shady guy lurking in the back of this room, hiding behind the curtain. So I can only imagine she was dragging me in there so that they could like turn me over. I guess that was a little spin of theirs. You know, that's always a danger with sex workers, because they're going to take it for granted that you're probably not going to want to report that thing to the police, because normally you're going to have some sort of embarrassment value. They probably think you're in a relationship, so you don't want to make a big scene. So there's always a chance, especially where in places where sex work is, you know, illegal or frowned upon or socially unacceptable, then you're going to have an element of like scamming customers coming in. Anyway, the guys managed to kind of, you know, me and the guys managed to pull me away from this woman, and she was like screaming as we like ran off laughing up the road. Anyway, they actually ended up, you know, bearing in mind I was 19, they ended up sending me in to one of these girls, because we were walking along and I was saying, oh, that girl's so beautiful, she's really pretty. And these guys said, you know, you're going in there. So I remember being 19 and actually having that experience. And for any guys interested, it was a pretty dreadful experience. You know, I was 19, I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Frankly, I was frightened out of my wits. I would have much rather, like, we'd have been attacked by a bunch of dudes. I would have been way more confident dealing with that than I was dealing with like one beautiful lady. Even though she was being paid to be with me, it was a complete failure. You know, so it's not something I've ever wanted to do again. It's something I like tried as a young man, because as young men you're interested in that kind of thing, especially if the girl's beautiful. But yeah, that wasn't a good thing for me. And I think she was nice enough, but it was a very like a business-like manner, and you have to be a certain kind of person to want to do, you know, like a business trade when it comes to that. I'm not a kind of business trade sex type of guy. I'm more of a let's get friendly, get to know each other. And of course that's not really going to happen in that situation. So I quickly found out that that wasn't in my priority list of things that I wanted to be doing. She probably had a very disappointing time as well. I mean, that's the other part of it for me is, as I got older, I realised my kind of kink was that I like to see the other person having some enjoyment, the woman that I was with. That was what got me going, and you're never really going to get that. You're going to get people fake it in the industry, but it's very unlikely you're going to meet a girl that is actually really enjoying herself when you're like the 25th guy that's been in her bed that day. In fact, you're probably causing her, you know, mild pain, because she's probably had enough doing stuff like that. So yeah, just not my vibe. But anyway, that's kind of sets the scene for what I knew about prostitution. Fast forward a little while, of course, I'd come across quite a lot of prostitutes working in the clubs and pubs and stuff like that. We generally had a pretty easy manner with them. Like, if they weren't taking the mick, if they weren't doing anything blatantly wrong, I didn't really care. You know, if they were presenting themselves in a non-offensive, quiet kind of manner and going up to guys and whatever, that's not my problem. The only time it became problematic is when we had girls that were coming in that were being really aggressive. They were being drunk, they would get demanded with the guys, trying to kind of scam the guys or whatever, and in those points we had to ask the girls to leave, get rid of them. But that was a fairly regular deal, you know, it wasn't uncommon. And I actually got asked by one of these girls that was coming into the club. She asked me if I could work for her for a while, and I said maybe, you know, what's the deal? And basically she was being stalked by an ex-boyfriend. So it was nothing to do with her sex work. She was being bombarded with threats, messages. He was creeping around at night, trying to scare her, bang on her windows. But he had made some quite concerning threats that he was going to come round and attack her in various different ways. Quite unpleasant things that he wanted to do to her. So she basically wanted the nights when she was working to hire someone that would do like close protection for her, which I said, yeah, sure, no problem. So I had to accompany this girl when she was doing her work, and that was kind of interesting. It gives me a bit of an inner view of that kind of work that I'd never had before. And I'd already made a video about the industry of like stripping. I used to work in a strip club, so I'd seen a lot of stuff going on there, and it might have seemed like I was kind of being down on sex workers. I was actually just telling the truth about what I had witnessed in the club that I'd worked in. No shade from that perspective, and I'm not down on sex workers per se, because this experience actually had the opposite effect. That I was expecting kind of guys turning up that were really cocky, unpleasant guys that, were kind of braggadocious and young, sort of pushing their weight around. And actually I found the complete opposite. This seemed to be a service that had some sort of community benefit to it when I started seeing the customers turn up. She was obviously concerned that this weird stalker guy was trying to come in, so she would have me basically check out the door, make sure that someone who was at the door was not this guy, and then I would just let her get on with whatever she got on with. They would disappear, and I would just sit in the kitchen making sure no one was trying to break into the house or whatever. And this went on for quite a while, but pretty much 99% of those clients that turned up were ranging from people that were clearly lacking in certain like social skills. They had no like social etiquette. Some of them would have been like on the spectrum, I guess, if they had have gone and got sort of qualified professionally. Some of them were clearly had like disorders, severe physical or mental disorders that were preventing them from having a regular sex life or preventing them from getting successful dates. This was like watching The Undateables, but it was like way worse than The Undateables. These poor people, there was very little opportunity for them to have any kind of sexual pleasure outside of how they found it with this girl. So I used to say to her, that was the surprising factor for me. It was like the standard of the customers. And she said, look, most of my customers are people that are, they need some tenderness, some affection. They've missed that for whatever reason, be it through disability or, nervousness or mental health issues or whatever it was. They had like lost out on that part. And I kind of tried to put myself in their shoes. And I just imagined what it would be like to be in that situation where you had no option. It's something I've probably always taken for granted, that I was quite good at talking. I didn't look handsome, but I wasn't kind of a complete mess. So as long as you can have a chat, smile, and you can kind of make some jokes or whatever, you've got a pretty good chance of meeting someone, getting a date, whatever. And, I tried to put myself in the perspective of what if anything you did, wasn't good enough? What if you had things wrong with you that just wouldn't allow for that to occur? And you would get very frustrated. You would crave not just a release in terms of the sexual side of things, but you would also crave that physical intimacy and closeness. And so the girl was really quite sweet, because she was providing them, and she wasn't charging that much money. This wasn't a complete rip-off. Again, I was surprised how little money it was. It was like £100 odd for, half an hour or something. It wasn't like a complete rip-off. She wasn't the most beautiful girl I've ever seen in the world, but she did seem to really care about the people. They were regulars. They had a very nice, they were very comfortable with her. She made them feel very looked after and secure, because some of these guys were like so timid. You know, if she'd have turned around quickly and said boo, they would have literally run up the road. You know, they were highly anxious people. And she was almost, it reminded me a little bit like a healthcare worker. You know, she was providing a sort of psychiatric service almost. It sounds really weird, but that was completely at odds to what I was expecting. You know, I was thinking like all these like crazy perverts would be coming around and people swinging off the ceiling and chandeliers, and it was so far removed from that. I mean, yes, there was sometimes sex going on, but she said often there was just like cuddling, a little bit of like intimate touching or whatever, and it was about the connection and the time that they were spending together, which again really surprised me. That wasn't at all what I was expecting. And she introduced me to some of her friends. Often they would come round later on at night. I guess they had all, you know, been doing the same thing she had. They all were working in that industry, and they would kind of come round and call on her and have a coffee and a cigarette or whatever. And I used to get chatting to them, you know, because they were all talkative girls. Most of them were Eastern European origin, but nice girls. They all like chain smoked like absolute troopers. And that was the only bit I didn't like about it, because it was quite a small kitchen that I was sat in, and these girls would literally just smoke one cigarette after the other. So it was like so thick with smoke in there you could hardly see. But when I sort of spoke to them and said, you know, I'm so surprised about what goes on, and they were like, oh, you know, that's most of our clients as well. What they said they didn't like, you know, if a young fit dude turned up at the door, they would actually be disappointed, you know, and that's completely the opposite to how people imagine it, right? You imagine, oh, they're going to be well happy when this like hottie turns up, you know, this buff guy. No, that wasn't what they wanted at all, because he's the guy that's most likely to be a problem. He's most likely to complain. He's probably going to be kind of aggressive in what he's doing. He's going to try and get like the maximum value for money, because he doesn't really feel like he should be paying for it anyway. He might be there to just take out his aggressive urges, you know, because he's got some kink in that direction. He might be a bit of a narcissistic idiot. So they really didn't want those guys. They would be very happy when a guy turned up who was like older, obese, disability, you know, all the things that you would normally think, oh no, you wouldn't want that guy to turn up. That's exactly what they were looking for, because they knew that that person would be, they knew how to please that kind of person, and they knew that person would leave in a state that was better than they arrived in, right? That they would have had a really good time, and that was important to the girls, that the customers were looked after and would want to come back. And generally those kind of cocky guys, it would be like a one-off thing, you know, maybe the guy hadn't got laid that night and he was planning on it, he got let down or whatever at the nightclub, and then as a last ditch hope he had just sort of rung a number or whatever and turned up at one of these girls' doors. But he's very unlikely to ever come back to them, and he's probably not going to be very nice to them. Whereas the other clients, you know, they were bringing flowers, they were bringing like chocolate bars and stuff for the girls, they're bringing their favourite bottle of wine. So it was a really nice kind of thing to see. It was like a friendship, and it was kind of a service to people with various different disabilities. The last experience I can think of to do with the sex industry, we were working a club, and a few doors down there was a girl that was working that was clearly you know, selling sexual services. She would sometimes come out for a cigarette, and although she had like a kimono sort of dressing gown on, underneath that was obviously some like leather gear sometimes, and PVC and whatever. So we kind of got the impression maybe she's a model, or she's like doing some kind of kinky photos. And we got talking to her after a while, because she used to sort of wander over and ask for a light or whatever. And it turned out she was a dominatrix. And she even like offered and showed us around what she was doing. And that was exactly what I thought it was going to be, and kind of more shocking than I thought it was going to be. It's not something I would take a moral judgment about, because again, she's fulfilling a service for people that are adults, that are sound of mind, that completely wanted to partake in this kind of thing. But I was kind of shocked at the levels people were going to get off on this kind of stuff. I'd obviously heard that people like being whipped and stamped on and walked on or whatever with stilettos, but some of the stuff I just found really odd. So she showed us, she had like a trapdoor in the ground, and these guys would get in there. It was like a small dark little cupboard that was kind of in the floor. It had been like built up on this staging, and then she would urinate and defecate on these guys through this like little cage hole in the top, and they would just pay to be in there for several hours while she abused them, you know, did those things to them. So I was very surprised people would pay for that, because I would have thought you could probably get that for free. But yeah, that was one thing that opened my eyes a little bit. And then she showed us some videos that her and her customers had made. You know, she had done these videos with their permission. They were like wearing masks or whatever. But some of these videos, she then went on, her biggest money, she said, was actually selling these things online. People really like buying the videos, especially overseas. And in the videos, she was properly hurting some of these guys, and they were really enjoying it. But you know, I thought it was like, oh, he got a couple of bruises. No, like she was putting some of these people into hospital, like serious damage to their organs, you know, like not good at all. The sort of thing that would make me feel physically sick to even think about. Hitting them in those regions with like lumps of wood while they were clipped onto another piece of wood is one example. And I can't really go into graphic detail, but it was rough, like much rougher than I kind of expected. It was really hardcore. So, you know, they obviously had to go and get medical treatment after this, but these guys would come back and repeat the procedure. So they obviously enjoyed it. And the kind of culmination of all that was that she actually nearly killed a guy one night. She actually ended up with an unconscious customer who was like hung up on a strap around his neck. So he'd obviously been doing that thing where they like restrict the breathing, and he was so heavy that she couldn't get him off this strap, couldn't get him down, and she had to call for assistance, and the guys from the club like ran around there and basically got this guy down. But he would have died, you know, and he was still quite happy about that. He wasn't looking to press charges on her or anything, you know. He was, if anything, he was apologetic to her for causing her any problems and humiliation. The only other funny thing, that's not really sex industry based, although it might have been, but at that same club, there was a window opposite, and every single Friday night, a guy, it was like 2 floors up, a guy used to stand in this window completely naked, and he would stand there like with his arms out, his legs like outstretched, as if he was doing the sort of crucifixion stance. And then he would start touching himself, and he would be staring at me the whole time, and he would literally wait for me to be out doing the door whilst he did that. And it happened every week. And one time the police were walking by, and I said, oh, you're just in time for the show, because the police used to sometimes stop by and say, you know, what are you guys up to? Have you seen anything going on? You know, any troubles or whatever? They would like digging for information basically, and we would be chatting away to them, asking how the other clubs were getting on. And I said, oh, you're just in time for the show. And he said, what do you mean? I said, oh, look up at that window on the 2nd floor. Sure enough, just after 9, this guy appears, and he wasn't at all bothered that the police were there. So he's completely nude in the window, doing his business. And I mean, he did the whole business till the end, if you know what I mean, on the window. So yeah, it was a show. And the police just laughed, and I said, surely that's illegal, right? You know, you're not supposed to be doing that. And they just sort of laughed and walked off. I think it was because it was Brighton, and there was the intimation that he was gay, and that basically the gay community in Brighton got a kind of free rein to do a lot of things that maybe the straight community wouldn't have done. I mean, if you were a straight guy standing in a window doing that to random passers-by, I would imagine you would get in quite a lot of trouble. Certainly the idea that I get from, you know, listening to programmes about the police and people getting arrested for indecent exposure and stuff. I'm not sure how it works if you're doing that from within your house, but I'm pretty sure that's not legal. But yeah, in Brighton it just becomes a big joke because the community there don't want to bring any sort of bad gossip or headlines into anything, so it all just gets brushed under the carpet. Frankly, I didn't really care about it, but I just don't like double standards. You know, I think if you're going to have a rule that people aren't supposed to be doing that, and let's face it, there was nothing stopping like families with children from walking by at that point. I can't remember if any did, but there were like restaurants just up the road, Italian restaurants and stuff that people were walking to. So he wasn't just impacting me, you know, that could have been anyone that looked up and saw a pretty disgusting thing going on. I hope you guys have found that interesting. That was my kind of blunt take on the industry. I'm sure there's lots of different parts of the industry. There's all kinds of different things going on. This is just my experience, and it was way back when as well, you know, a good few years ago now. So things have most likely changed. I would imagine there's still a lot of that kind of service going on to people that you would not maybe expect were customers of the sex industry. And I would be fascinated to hear in the comments if you're in that industry, or if you know people in that industry and that rings a bell and you have lots of customers like that. I'd be fascinated to hear if that's still the case. If so, great, it's a really good service you're doing. And if you've had any bad experiences yourself or funny experiences, chuck them in the comments as well. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care. I'll catch you next time.